Chapter 1. The Crash. The midday sun scorched the pavement, shimmering waves of heat dancing over the desolate highway. Not a soul in sight, until the screech of tires shattered the silence. A silver sedan swerved violently, skidding across the lanes before crashing into the guardrail. The impact was brutal. Metal crunched, glass exploded, and then silence returned. Elena Brooks had just finished a grueling night shift at Rivergate General. Dressed in her navy scrubs with a stethoscope still hanging around her neck, she was driving home on that same empty road. Her eyes blinked against the harsh light, exhaustion pulling at her bones, until the crash yanked her back to full alert. She pulled over without hesitation. By the time she reached the wreck, a man, white, in his 40s, had already crawled out of the mangled car. He was sprawled on the asphalt, one leg clearly broken and bleeding heavily from a deep gash. He was in shock, moaning in pain, barely conscious. Elena dropped to her knees beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked firmly, brushing sweat from her forehead. "Don't move. You've got a deep laceration. I need to stop the bleeding." The man's eyes opened, wide, terrified. "No, no, get away!" he cried, trying to scoot back, his voice raw with panic. Elena froze for a split second, not because of fear, but because of recognition. She'd seen that reaction before, that look that said, "You don't belong here," that edge of suspicion reserved not for her actions, but for her skin. "Sir, I'm a nurse," she said calmly, raising both hands to show she meant no harm. "You're losing a lot of blood. I'm trying to help you." He whimpered, glancing at her scrubs, the stethoscope, then back at her face. Confusion warred with pain, but the bleeding won. He slumped slightly, nodding faintly. Elena tore the sleeves off his shirt to make a temporary tourniquet, tightening it above the wound. Blood stained her hands. The sun burned hotter. Time dragged. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "One-car collision. Male victim. Significant leg trauma," she reported quickly. "Conscious, but in pain. We're on Route 9, mile marker 42. Just then, the sound of approaching cars filled the air. A few drivers finally stopped. Some pulled out phones, not to call for help, but to record. Elena ignored them. She focused on the man, now semi-conscious. "You're okay," she whispered. "Help is coming." A voice from behind barked, "Hey! What's going on here?" She turned to see a man in a trucker hat pointing his phone at her, his eyes narrowed. "Did you do this to him?" "No," she replied flatly. "I'm a nurse. I stopped to help." But already she could hear murmurs, doubt, suspicion, and something colder underneath. Not even a hero in uniform could escape the weight of their assumptions. Chapter 2. Don't touch me. The man's breathing had turned shallow, his skin pale with shock. Elena pressed gently against the torn flesh, trying to slow the bleeding, but the moment her hand touched his leg again, he flinched violently. "I said don't touch me!" he shouted, louder this time, his voice echoing off the highway. Several bystanders had gathered now. None of them had come close enough to help, but their phones were recording. Elena's hands froze mid-motion, blood still glistening on her gloves. She inhaled slowly, steadying her voice. "You're going into hypovolemic shock. I know you're scared, but if I don't apply pressure, you might pass out or worse." But the man wasn't listening. He was staring straight at her, eyes wide and confused, lips trembling. And then it came out, muttered, almost under his breath, but enough for the nearby crowd to catch. "You people always cause problems." The words punched through the air like a slap. Elena blinked, stunned. For a second, everything else disappeared. The noise, the heat, the urgency. All she could hear was the familiar sting of prejudice, dressed in pain but soaked in venom. A woman in the crowd holding a toddler on her hip gasped. Another man muttered, I knew something was off. Elena didn't move. She didn't look away. She just kept applying pressure, her voice a whisper now. I'm here to help, no matter what you think of me. The distant sound of sirens grew louder finally. Help was coming. But the crowd had already made up their minds. They didn't see the bleeding man or the calm nurse trying to save him. They saw an angry white man yelling, "Don't touch me," to a black woman in scrubs. They saw a story they wanted to believe. A uniformed officer arrived moments later, stepping out of the cruiser with one hand on his belt. "What's going on here?" Elena stood, keeping her voice clear. "I'm a nurse. I found him like this. He crashed. Severe leg injury. I applied a tourniquet and called 911. The officer's eyes dropped to her hands, bloodied, trembling slightly. Then to the man on the ground, still clutching his thigh, moaning. He walked past her without responding and crouched beside the injured man. "Did she do this to you, sir?" The man blinked, confused. I don't know." It was enough. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," the officer said firmly, now facing her. "I'm not done. He still needs pressure on the wound," Elena argued, holding up her medical ID badge. "Look, I'm a registered trauma nurse, Rivergate General." But the officer didn't check it. His backup was already arriving. One of them reached for her arm. "Please step away from the victim now." She stared at them, stunned. "I'm the only reason he's alive." But in that moment, on that sunlit stretch of highway, it didn't matter. She was no longer seen as a nurse. She was just a suspect. Chapter 3. The cameras. By the time the ambulance arrived, the crowd had doubled. Cars idled on the shoulder. Drivers leaned out of their windows, snapping photos, filming video clips, whispering suspicions. Elena stood a few feet away, arms folded tightly against her chest, eyes scanning the scene. She could still see the man she tried to save, now on a stretcher, IV in his arm, oxygen mask over his face. The paramedics barely acknowledged her. No one asked her name. Instead, the attention shifted to the officers circling her. "Ma'am, do you have any identification?" one of them asked, the same one who had grabbed her arm earlier. She pulled her hospital ID from her scrub pocket. "Elena Brooks, RN Emergency Trauma Unit." The officer took it, glanced at it briefly, then handed it back. "And you're saying you had nothing to do with the accident?" "I just finished a 14-hour shift," she replied, her voice sharp now. "I saw the crash. I pulled over. I applied a tourniquet to keep him from bleeding out. That's all." A younger cop, maybe new on the force, stepped forward hesitantly. "She was the first one helping when we pulled up," he offered. Didn't look like she was fleeing or hiding. The senior officer didn't respond. He turned instead toward the gathering crowd. "Anyone here see what happened before she arrived?" A man in cargo shorts raised his phone. "I didn't see the crash, but I got footage of her kneeling over the guy, touching his leg and all." The officer nodded. "Can you send that to me?" Another woman chimed in. "It just looked wrong, you know." Him bleeding and her hovering over him like that. And he was shouting, looked scared. Elena clenched her jaw. She wanted to scream, to demand why nobody had asked why he was shouting, why nobody cared that she was performing first aid. But she had seen how this went too many times before. Emotion would be turned against her. Silence was safer. The paramedics loaded the man into the ambulance and drove off. Elena watched as the taillights disappeared down the highway. Her hands were still stained with his blood. The officer turned back. "We'll need a full statement at the station." "I've already given my account," she said flatly. "Let's make it official," he replied, reaching for his handcuffs. "What are you doing?" Elena asked, backing away. "I'm not under arrest." "You're being detained for questioning." The cold steel wrapped around her wrists before she could protest further. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Phones zoomed in. Someone whispered, They got her! Elena closed her eyes, not from fear, but fury. The road was empty again, except this time she was the one being taken away. Chapter 4. Sirens and Silence. The back seat of the squad car was hot and suffocating. Elena sat stiffly, her wrists still bound, the dried blood on her hands starting to itch. She watched the highway recede through the dusty rear window, her heart thudding, not with fear, but disbelief. She had saved a man's life. Now she was being treated like a criminal. At the precinct, no one greeted her. No one looked her in the eye. She was processed without explanation, her badge and ID bagged like evidence. A female officer patted her down and confiscated her phone. Elena tried to explain, again and again, but her words were swallowed by procedure. They placed her in a small gray interrogation room. No windows, just a table, 2 chairs, and a camera blinking red in the corner. The silence was brutal. 20 minutes passed. 30. Finally, the door opened. A detective stepped in, middle-aged, white, with a polished badge and an air of quiet authority. He set a manila folder on the table, sat down, and looked at her. "Miss Brooks, thank you for your patience." Elena said nothing. He opened the folder. "You say you're a trauma nurse, but what we have right now are multiple witness statements claiming you were kneeling over an injured man, and that he appeared to be afraid of you." "I was treating him," she said coldly. "I applied a tourniquet. He was bleeding out." "Did he ask for your help?" "He couldn't think straight. He was in shock." The detective leaned back in his chair. "He said something about you causing problems." Elena's lips tightened. "You mean his racist outburst? You're seriously taking that as evidence?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the folder and pulled out a few printouts, screenshots from a shaky phone video. One showed her kneeling, another the man flinching, a third her bloody hands. "Context matters," Elena said, her voice low. "But no one here seems interested in that." He closed the folder. "We're still investigating. You're not under arrest at this point, but we need to verify your story. For now, you're free to go, but you may be called back." A uniformed officer escorted her out. No apology. No thanks. Outside the station, the sun had begun to set. Elena stood on the sidewalk, her scrubs wrinkled, her hands still sticky. Her car was still on the highway, her phone was gone, her dignity bruised, and her name already trending online. Chapter 5. Detained by Assumption. The news broke before Elena even got home. Bystander or suspect, nurse detained after highway incident. The headline flashed on her neighbor's TV as she walked past their window. By the time she reached her apartment door, her inbox had exploded with messages, some concerned, some accusatory, most from people who didn't even know her. The footage had gone viral, not the crash, not the blood, just the 10-second clip of her hovering over the injured man and his startled reaction. Stripped of context, it looked like something else entirely, and the internet ran with it. Words like attacker, aggressor, and unlicensed trended alongside her name. She hadn't even been given a chance to speak. Inside her apartment, Elena collapsed onto the couch. Her hands trembled as she turned on the news. The segment was already airing on local stations. The identity of the woman seen applying pressure to the victim's wound has been confirmed as Elena Brooks, a registered nurse at Rivergate General. Officials are still investigating what role, if any, she played in the crash. The victim remains hospitalized and in stable condition. Elena stared at the screen. They used her full name, her workplace, her image, but not her voice. She picked up her landline and dialed the hospital. After 4 rings, her supervisor answered. "Hi, it's Elena," she said quietly. I'm sure you've seen the news." A pause. Then, "Elena, I need to be honest. The board has been receiving calls since this morning. Until things clear up, they're asking you to take an unpaid leave. Elena's throat went dry. I saved his life. I know. But perception is everything right now. She hung up without saying goodbye. That night, her phone, returned at last, buzzed non-stop. Some messages were from friends, others from reporters, but most were from strangers spewing rage and slurs. One message read, "If he had died, you'd be in jail where you belong." She stared at the screen. Her pulse pounded. She had done everything right. She had acted with courage, with skill, with humanity, and it wasn't enough. She wasn't judged by her actions, only by her presence. Chapter 6. The Viral Verdict. The next morning, Elena woke up to find her name plastered across national headlines. Her face appeared on morning news panels, talk shows, and viral reaction videos. Nurse or menace? Would you let her near your family? He screamed for help. Did she hurt him first? None of them mentioned the tourniquet. None of them mentioned the 911 call she made. None of them asked why she stayed. The internet had already rendered its verdict, without evidence, without testimony, without truth. The 10-second video looped endlessly. Commentators debated her intentions. Strangers wrote essays about her suspicious demeanor. Even former patients were asked to weigh in on whether she'd ever seemed aggressive. Elena watched in stunned silence. She wasn't just a trending name now, she was a symbol, a scapegoat, and she was utterly alone. Later that afternoon, her apartment buzzer rang. It was her friend and fellow nurse, Nicole. "I told the charge nurse I had food poisoning," Nicole said as she stepped inside, arms full of takeout. "I couldn't keep working while my best friend gets dragged on national TV." Elena tried to smile, but couldn't. She collapsed into her chair. "They've turned me into a villain, Nick, for helping someone, for doing my job." Nicole sat down, handing her a bowl of noodles. "You didn't just help someone. You saved a man who didn't want to be saved, because of who you are." Elena didn't reply. Nicole leaned forward. "This isn't about medicine. It's about perception. You know that. And now everyone with a platform thinks they can judge you without knowing anything." Elena's phone buzzed again. This time, a message from a journalist at a major network. "Would you be willing to share your side of the story live on our morning show?" Nicole read over her shoulder. "You should do it." "They'll twist my words." "Maybe," Nicole said. "But right now, silence is letting them define you." Elena looked out the window. The sky outside was gray, heavy with rain. She hadn't stepped outside in 2 days. Not since being detained, not since watching the world unravel around her. But maybe it was time to speak. Not just for herself, but for every nurse, doctor, bystander, or good Samaritan judged by the color of their skin before the content of their actions. She picked up her phone and typed a reply. "Yes, I'll tell my story." Chapter 7. The Interview. Elena stood in the backstage green room of the studio, clutching a warm paper cup of tea. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. She was a nurse, not a speaker. Her world was blood pressure monitors and trauma charts, not cameras and spotlights. But this was different. Nicole had helped her prep the night before, repeating the same phrase, "Speak your truth." You were there. They weren't. A producer peeked into the room. "You're on in 5. Elena nodded. Minutes later, she stepped onto the set of Morning Insight. The host, a polished blonde woman with a practiced smile, greeted her and motioned to a chair. Behind them, a massive screen displayed the paused video, Elena in mid-motion, crouched over the injured man, the frame that had defined her. "Thank you for being here, Ms. Brooks," the host began, voice honey-smooth. "You've been at the center of a national conversation since last week's highway incident. Many have seen the viral footage, but not everyone has heard your side. So, tell us, what really happened?" Elena took a breath, looked into the camera. and spoke. "I was driving home after a night shift. I saw the crash. I stopped because I had the training and the obligation to help. I applied a tourniquet to his leg because he was bleeding out. I called 911. I stayed until help came." The host nodded slowly. "But the man you assisted reacted in fear. Some say it looked like he didn't want your help." Elena's voice remained even. "Yes." He flinched. "He told me not to touch him, but he was in shock, confused, and, let's be honest, he looked at me and saw a threat, not a nurse. That happens more than people admit." A beat of silence. The host shifted. "Some critics claim you escalated the situation, that you were confrontational. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't resist. I followed every order the officers gave me, but I was treated like a suspect from the moment they saw me." Behind her, the screen now showed her mugshot, taken after she was detained. Elena turned to it, held her ground. "That photo was taken after I just saved a man's life." The room grew still. Then the host said, "You've become something of a symbol." A face for racial profiling in emergency response. "What do you hope comes from all this?" Elena didn't hesitate. "I hope people stop deciding guilt based on skin. I hope first responders, bystanders, anyone can do what's right without being punished for how they look. And I hope one day I can go back to just being a nurse instead of a headline." When the cameras cut, there was a pause. Then, soft applause from the crew. The host reached over, gently touching Elena's hand. "You were powerful," she whispered. "Thank you." But outside, a different battle waited, because not everyone wanted to hear her truth. Some preferred the lie. Chapter 8. Public Outrage. Elena's interview aired across the country, and the internet exploded again. But this time, something changed. The hashtags number #NurseNotThreat and #Justice. For Elena began trending. Nurses, doctors, EMTs from every corner of the country posted their support. Photos in scrubs, stories of bias, clips of Elena's calm, steady voice on national TV. She had spoken with strength, with dignity, and people were listening. Still, not everyone was ready to admit they were wrong. That afternoon, Rivergate General released a short statement. "While we respect all of our staff, we continue to monitor the investigation. At this time, Nurse Brooks remains on administrative leave." Elena stared at the screen. "They still won't reinstate me." Nicole shook her head. "They're afraid of backlash, afraid of looking weak." "But they are weak," Elena muttered. "They watched the video. They know the truth." Later that evening, a crowd began to gather outside the hospital. What started as a small show of solidarity grew into a sea of voices. Health workers in white coats, activists holding signs, elderly patients who remembered Elena treating them, young nurses who saw themselves in her story. One sign read, "If Elena Brooks was white, she'd be called a hero." A local reporter approached the protest leader, an ICU nurse named Teresa. "What are your demands?" Teresa didn't hesitate. "Reinstate Nurse Brooks, apologize, and reform the system that made this possible in the first place." Inside the hospital, administrators watched nervously from tinted windows. Outside, the voices grew louder. "Say her name! She saved a life! Elena Brooks deserves justice!" That night, the hospital's social media page was flooded with over 10,000 comments, most in support. Some from former patients, a few from fellow black nurses who had stayed silent for too long. Even the man Elena saved, Thomas Greer, released a statement from his hospital bed. "I was confused. I was in pain. But what I remember most is that Elena Brooks saved my life. She didn't hesitate. I owe her everything." His words sparked another wave of support. The media tried to catch up. Talk shows flipped. Headlines changed tone. Elena went from suspect to survivor, from scapegoat to symbol. But she didn't want fame. She wanted her name back, and she wasn't done fighting yet. Chapter 9. Her name, her fight. Elena sat across from a civil rights attorney in a sunlit office downtown. The room was calm, but the decision in front of her was not. "You have a strong case," the attorney said, flipping through the folders. "Unlawful detainment, defamation, emotional distress, loss of income, and frankly, racial profiling." Elena nodded, silent. She had already relived that day 100 times in her mind. The flashing lights, the cold cuffs, the eyes that didn't see a nurse, only a black woman on a highway beside a white man in pain. "Filing this suit won't just be about money," the lawyer added. "It could change the policy, the training, the way these calls are handled when race becomes a factor." Elena exhaled slowly. Let's do it. When the lawsuit was announced, headlines flared again, this time with fire. Nurse sues city and hospital over highway incident. Elena Brooks files federal civil rights lawsuit. The defendants scoffed at first. The city attorney dismissed it as opportunistic. Rivergate General released a generic PR statement about reviewing workplace policies. But Elena didn't stop. She gave testimony, appeared on panels, met with local lawmakers, not for vengeance, but for reform. For every nurse who hesitated at a crash scene, afraid their kindness might be mistaken for threat. For every bystander whose skin color had turned help into suspicion, she became the face of a movement she never asked to lead. And people followed. Universities invited her to speak. Medical associations reviewed emergency protocols. Several police departments began implementing new de-escalation and anti-bias training inspired by her case. And slowly, something shifted. Elena's hospital board offered to reinstate her quietly, with back pay and a carefully worded letter. She declined. "You didn't stand up when it mattered," she told them. "Now I'm standing up for more than just myself." Still, she missed the work, the patients, the rush of purpose. So she joined a mobile trauma response unit, volunteer-based, community-focused, outside the hospital's walls. Because she hadn't stopped being a healer. She'd just learned the system didn't always protect those who did good. But Elena Brooks had found something stronger than protection. She had found her voice. And she was done, being silent. Chapter 10. Blood. That changed the law. A year later, Elena stood at the steps of the state capitol, her face solemn but unshaken. Dozens of reporters, lawmakers, and community leaders surrounded her. She wore a dark blazer, her nurse's badge clipped proudly to her pocket, not as a uniform, but as a symbol. Behind her, a banner stretched across the marble columns. Passing the Brooks Act, Equity in Emergency Response. The proposed legislation required law enforcement and emergency responders to complete implicit bias training. It mandated body cam footage be reviewed before any formal charges or suspensions. And most importantly, it protected bystanders who stepped in to help, regardless of race. Elena wasn't here to celebrate herself. She was here to make sure no one else went through what she had. The governor approached the podium and glanced at her before speaking. 1 year ago, a nurse stopped to help a stranger. She did what we hope any of us would do. And instead of being thanked, she was doubted, handcuffed, and vilified. Today, we correct that mistake. Not with apologies, but with action. Applause erupted as Elena stepped up next. She scanned the crowd, saw Nicole near the front, Teresa, the ICU nurse, Thomas Greer, now walking with a cane. Even a few of the younger officers who'd once stood silently now stood in uniform with heads bowed. "When I stopped my car that day," she began, voice steady, "I didn't see color. I saw a man who needed help, but the world didn't see a nurse. They saw a problem." Her eyes locked with the cameras. "But I am not a problem. I am the solution you refuse to see." The applause returned, louder this time, fierce, earned. Later that evening, she sat on a quiet park bench, watching children play in the grass. She had removed her blazer, shoes off, heels aching, soul full. In her lap rested a news article with the headline, "From Handcuffs to Legislation, the Elena Brooks Story." She folded it and smiled, not because justice had been served perfectly, but because the story no longer belonged to those who twisted it. It belonged to her, and to everyone who believed in doing the right thing, even when the world didn't believe in them. The Endwam.